You know, the first question I think we really should answer about VLAN hopping is how can something that sounds like so much fun be evil? You know, VLAN hopping? How can that be wrong? What'd you guys do last night? Oh, we went VLAN hopping. It was great. Well, if you went VLAN hopping last night, you were actually exploiting a security vulnerability in a network using .1Q, if you can believe that. .1Q, our friend when it comes to trunking, and trunking protocols, because the only other option really is ISL, and .1Q has much less overhead. It understands the native VLAN. We love .1Q tagging. .1Q, and we can't go back to ISL because a lot of Cisco switches don't even support ISL. So we better know all about VLAN hopping. And the first form of it we're going to take a look at is called double tagging, where the name is definitely the recipe. An intruder is going to transmit frames tagged with two separate VLAN IDs. Now, this is not the easiest attack for an intruder to even begin, because highly specific circumstances must exist in order to launch it. First, the intruding device has to be attached to an access port. Next, the VLAN used by that access port has to be the native VLAN. And then finally, if ISL is in use, then it's over, because ISL is not vulnerable to this attack type because it doesn't use the native VLAN concept. So .1Q is the one vulnerable here. And this is our walkthrough. We're going to have a rogue host connected to an access port on the multi-layer switch, which is trunking with another multi-layer switch using .1Q, and the native VLAN is 25. These could be layer 2 switches as well. This is not an attack that is only good on layer 3 switches. I just wanted to show some L3 switches. Now, the switch receiving the double tagged frame sees that tag for the native VLAN, and of course that's not going to go across the trunk with that on there. If a frame is destined for the native VLAN, it's going to go across the trunk untagged. That's one thing we like about .1Q. Well, the tag is removed, frame is forwarded across the trunk, and the problem here is that of the two tags that were there, one is still there. And that's the tag for VLAN 100, so you start to see where the hopping part comes in. Because when the remote switch receives the frame, it sees the tag for VLAN 100 and says, oh, okay, that the ports in VLAN 100 need this frame. So the rogue has now successfully hopped from one VLAN to another. And you might look at this and say, Chris, that's interesting, but it doesn't really sound all that bad. And in and of itself, it's not incredibly destructive, but it can be used as a springboard for other kinds of network attacks. Because what it's doing, the intruder is now hopped to another VLAN, and that intruder is able to gather information that he or she may not be able to get otherwise if he had not been able to VLAN hop. And again, it's a springboard. It's ranged from Trojan horse virus propagation to bank account number and password theft. And VLAN hopping is how these attacks got started. So it is something we have to be aware of. And to prevent this double tagging, we can use one of these three techniques. First, you could change the native VLAN to an unused VLAN with switch port trunk native VLAN. Not a bad idea. Now, that's something you'd have to do on both ends of the trunk, of course. You want to keep your native VLAN the same going across that trunk. You could just make an agreement not to use the default native VLAN, because everybody knows what that is. That's part of the problem, is that an intruder would just make the assumption, okay, I'm going to bet that this admin has not changed that default native VLAN of 1. Everybody knows what that is. Also, if your switches all allow use of this command, you could use the VLAN.1Q tag native command to prevent the native VLAN tag from being removed in the first place. And not all your switches are going to run that, not all your models. So you want to check iOS on your particular switch before you use that. So just a quick illustration there and a reminder, set the native VLAN to an empty VLAN. You could also prune it from the trunk. A couple of good approaches here to stop double tagging. Now, switch spoofing. That takes VLAN hopping, cliche alert, to the next level, but it really does. It's much bigger, because this attack allows a rogue device to pretend to be a member of every VLAN in our network. And worse, this is made possible in part by a very common Cisco switch port default setting. You know which one it is? Some Cisco switch ports, many of them actually, run in dynamic desirable trunking mode by default. And that includes at least one of the switches we're using in our labs. It doesn't make these switches bad. In one way, we like this because a trunk can form with no additional configuration. And I'm going to bring a switch up in a moment that I write erased, I delete VLAN.deaded, and config-wise, it's a brand new switch. And I hope, after I wrote this on the board, that it managed to form a trunk with no config for me, because the port connected to another switch via crossover cable is running in dynamic desirable mode. Let's go ahead and bring that up, and you can see the usual falderall and flotsam and jetsam we get after a write erase, and I said I didn't want anything to do with startup mode, and we got all of these messages, and I haven't touched a thing since then, actually. So I'm just getting to the setup mode prompt, so I haven't even gotten that far. And I'm going to say no, I'm going to hit return to get started. We're at the switch prompt, and I haven't done anything. And if we run show interface trunk right here, we already have a trunk. And that actually formed while the switch was waiting for me to say, hey Chris, do you or do you not want to start setup mode? Isn't that wild? And the thing is, it's because this port was in dynamic desirable mode, and the port on the other end was acceptable to forming a trunk. It didn't have to be in desirable mode, just one of them has to be, as long as they're both agreeable one way or another to forming a trunk. So, that's a good thing. It's one less thing for you and I, the admin staff, to worry about, but it can be used against us, and here's why. The reason that trunk formed is because a port that's in dynamic desirable mode, and let me show you this one more time. It's just going to appear as desirable here in show interface trunk. That port is sending out dynamic trunking protocol frames, DTP frames, in an aggressive effort to form a trunk. And the problem is that the switch knows it's sending DTP frames, but has no idea who's getting them. And basically the switch is saying, gee, I hope only the legitimate devices get these frames, and I'm not sending them to a switch that perhaps is not under my admin's administrative control, a rogue switch, because that does happen. Now, a well-meaning network admin might put that port and other ports into auto mode, which means the port will trunk, but it's not actively attempting to do so. This solution, as sometimes happens in life and in networking, leads to another problem, because a rogue host connected to a port in auto mode can pretend it's a switch, and it can generate DTP frames of its own. If that sounds far-fetched, you could go online and find a program to do that in less than a minute. Less than a minute. And the problem is, this leads to a trunk between our switch and someone else's switch, or someone else's device that is pretending to be a switch. So this is a very, very bad situation, because that rogue host could just generate DTP frames, not a problem, and all of a sudden has a trunk leading into our network. Now, to defend against switch spoofing, you should do one of the following to every port on your switch that is not trunking with another switch known to be under your administrative control. First, turn DTP frames off, period, with switch port no negotiate. My personal favorite, turn trunking off with switch port mode access. My real personal favorite is to close all unused switch ports. Going to be a little bit of a dad lecture here, don't leave early. In all seriousness, I strongly recommend you close all unused switch ports on your switches, because by default, as we all know, Cisco switch ports are open. There's no need to leave the door unlocked, so to speak, when you're trying to keep people out. On a router, everything is shut down by default. On a switch, all those physical ports are open. Just go ahead and shut them, and believe me, interface range is your friend there. If you've got 64 ports but 32 hosts, you got 32 ports just sitting there, one interface range command could shut all those interfaces in a couple of seconds. It doesn't take any time at all. So I would strongly recommend that, but these are all good defenses against switch spoofing. Coming up next, DHCP snooping. It sounds like an attack and it sounds like a defense. We're going to see exactly which one it is. Plus, I have two brand new labs for you on this topic that I have never run in a course before. I know you're going to enjoy them. We're really going to go into some nuts and bolts here with DHCP snooping that you need to know for the exam, and especially for real-world networking. And I'm going to clear up one misconception about DHCP snooping on live equipment. So I will see you in the next video, and we'll take care of business.